Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of No One's a Critic. Kino and Mac, as always, as the hosts. How you doing this week, Mac?
Not bad. Just chilling. Haven't really seen any. Um, what was the movie I just saw that I thought was actually pretty good? Oh, you know what I saw? I finally got around to watching it. Was Sound of Freedom.
Oh yeah, the pedophile movie.
Yeah. And it's so funny because back when it was released, it was so controversial because people on the left were like, "Oh, this is like pushing QAnon conspiracy theory and yada yada yada," and then people on the right were like, the left doesn't want you to see this movie because it's like they're all pedophiles. And then there was that whole like conspiracy that like AMC was um breaking the AC in the theater so people couldn't see it, which like I don't think that was true at all. Um and so I was like, oh, finally, it's been on my watch list. I need to get around to seeing it. Um and it was like the most like mid movie I've ever seen in my life. Like there was like nothing about it that was like, it was just so, it's just so funny how like this movie caused all this controversy. Like, okay, that's funny, but
No, I mean it's the ongoing culture war that people. That movie was held up as like I didn't see it, but it was held up as like one of the conservative type films, like pushing back against the liberal media. And I don't care about that at all either. So
it was, well, that's what's funny because like in the film's defense, I mean, like it's not a very good. I don't think it's a very good film, but like it wasn't, it wasn't filled with like QAnon, like because I think the main guy, Jim Caviezel, um, I think he's kind of nuts. I think he like pushed a conspiracy theory that like pedophiles are like drinking the blood of children to try and like, yeah, weird stuff. But the movie itself doesn't have any of that. It's a pretty standard, like, if like sort of like boring, like, I don't know, drama thriller, I
yeah,
guess.
yeah, yeah. No,
um
I think it was the real life actors like stuff going on, and then the fact that it wasn't like a mainstream movie, people were like propping it up as like going against liberal media. Don't give a shit either way.
well, it's just so funny how like the actual content of the film, like 90% of the controversy or like everything that was going on around it had nothing to do with the actual content of the film. It's a very, I almost wonder if it's going to be looked back on as like a very, um, as a case study. Like, cause like there are some films where it's like, okay, this is a pretty, like, the content of the film is controversial. So I understand, why people are like, up in arms about it. But this was like such a nothing burger.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
I
really
mean, I
funny.
think most controversial films really are not like. There's nothing really going on in them. Even a lot of like the woke films and stuff like that we talked about before. It's like, are they woke? I mean, I don't know. Not really. Like the Little Mermaid, just because it had a black girl in the lead, like it wasn't pushing the message that like black people are superior to white people. Like that's not any kind of message in the film. It's just they cast a black person, and it's like people blow these things like way out of proportion. And if you don't want to watch it, don't watch it. But I think we talked about this before, but I think the idea that like films and media are pushing a conspiracy is like heavily overblown to me. Sure, sometimes they push ideology, but that's again, I think it's just the individual writers and stuff, their voice coming through. I don't really think there's a coordinated effort to push really ideal for the most part. I mean, you might find the odd example here and there of like, no, this was explicitly made to push an ideology or whatever, but I think most of the time it's just like they're just writing whatever bullshit they can, and some of their thoughts are going to bleed through onto the page.
Yeah. Or like to your point, like, I've heard movies like this movie. Um, oh, a perfect example was HBO's Watchmen, where it was like, this movie like owns white supremacy. And then I watched it and it's like, or then and then people on the right were like, oh, it's like super anti white. And then I watch it and it's like Regina King makes like a joke like, um, I smell bleach, like it, because he's like a white guy. Like it was such like menial shit. Like it was such like small, like uh, you know, wine mom liberal, just, like that sort of like controversial. Um, but yeah, it is funny how so much of the quote unquote controversy is completely separate from the actual content of the media.
Yeah, I mean
Um,
that's how it always goes though. Um Speaking of which though, let's transition into talking about our topic for this week. And but before we get into that though, actually, you had a little bit of news that I actually wasn't aware of this at all. We were talking about it before the podcast, but we have some news about Francis Ford Coppola, who we're going to be talking about the Godfather this episode. We're going to be breaking down the trilogy. But we have some news about one of his developments, and you kind of knew more about this than me. So you want to kind of talk about what's going on?
yeah, so Francis Ford Coppola, he is sort of like a very weird. He's sort of a weird case study in the sense where he had probably, I want to say, I don't even know if you can say arguably, inarguably, unarguably, probably one of the best runs of all time, maybe. He did The Godfather in 1972, The Conversation in 1974. That same year, he did The Godfather Part 2. And in 1979, he did Apocalypse Now. Those four films are just like, you could make an argument like those four films themselves are not only are at least three of them, I mean, The Conversation is also excellent, but three of them are, you could argue, are top 10 films of all time in general. Um, and the fact that he made them all in a row is just unbelievable. Um, but then after that, he just kind of, I don't want to say he fell off. He made The Outsiders, Rumblefish, um, Bram Stoker's Dracula later down the line. He made some good films after that. Um, but the the range of quality from his, like, obviously Jack is the big disaster with Robin Williams in the 90s. It's just, he just was never able to recapture that success after the 70s. Yeah.
I feel like his voice is like so defining to a certain time period, but it doesn't feel like that voice necessarily works or continues on into the more modern age. And I think again, I haven't seen all of his filmography. One of the ones you just pointed out that I did see was Bram Stoker's Dracula, and that's
Hmm.
a weird film.
Very weird
It's
film.
not bad, but it's also not really good. It's just kind of weird. It's kind of awkward at places, and that's where I'm like, maybe his voice is just not really working right as the times kind of change. There's something that's not quite landing about this film. Like it felt like there was intentionality behind that, but like it just didn't. It's like a joke that just didn't land for me.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned that when you talk about voice, because when I think of the other, like, sort of like, the film, what is it called? The film brats of the 70s, Scorsese, Spielberg, De Palma. Um, even Polanski, maybe, when I look at these filmmakers and I look at their films, there usually is, their voice, their style is very apparent in the films. Whether it's like, Scorsese with Raging Bull and Taxi Driver, Spielberg with Close Encounters and Jaws, De Palma with Blowout and Scarface. Um, it's very, you can kind of tell, oh, this is a De Palma film, this is a Scorsese film. What's interesting is that when I look at his four films, The Godfather, Godfather Part 2, Conversation, Apocalypse Now, I don't really feel, and this isn't, I want to make sure this isn't really like this isn't a criticism. I don't really see, oh, there's like threads that I see connected in the filmmaking. Um, and I think that's almost a good thing. I almost think that part of the reason, particularly that The Godfather, um, is such a good movie in my view, is that it kind of let the story speak for itself. It was made incredibly well. The performances were unbelievable, but it wasn't like, it didn't feel like a filmmaker was like, it didn't feel like he was trying to like be in your face with it. He was being very held back and restrained. Um, so he sort of had that instinct. But then you have Apocalypse Now, which is just like balls to the wall in unbelievable. But it fit what that mood was going for. It's almost like he adjusted his voice to the material, and that's in part why there's such
I think
incredible
he
film.
absolutely did for Godfather. I don't know if you've ever read the book by Mario Puzo, but in some of the later editions, Francis Ford Coppola writes the introduction to the book. He
Mhm.
talks about the film and his relationship with Mario Puzo, and I actually have the book right behind me. I bought that at Francis Ford Coppola's winery, which we actually didn't talk about the news, which we should circle back to in a
Oh
second,
yeah,
but
my
let me
apology.
just let me just finish my no, you're fine. Let me just finish my point though, which was in the introduction, he talks about this like gangster or Italian guy who came up to him and was talking to him about Mario Puzo, and he's like, "You didn't make him; he made you." To Francis Ford Coppola, and he kind of echoes that in the introduction, being that like he owes a lot to the book itself and to Mario Puzo and the story of the Godfather. Now, obviously, the movie is more famous than the book now, and he's very much responsible for a lot of that. But I think just reading that introduction, he had a lot of respect for Puzo and the work, and he intentionally kind of just let the material shine for itself. And I think that is what led to the success of the film, because it is just this really kind of classic story and classic material that not the book the movie's not 100% accurate to the book. There's a lot of
Thankfully,
other stuff. Yeah,
thankfully,
there's a lot of other weird stuff in the book.
yes,
But for what it is, I think the movie is definitely like very, very respectful and reverent to the material, and I think a lot of its success is owed to that. But let's circle back real quick to the news about this
yes.
new film.
So yeah, I mean, I kind of did want to see Sonny's gigantic penis, um, but
In the
yes. So
in the uncut version, you can see it there.
hell yeah. Um, but yeah, so after the 70s, Francis, he's made a couple good films, but overall he kind of, people were like, his time is come and gone. He kind of poked his beak into some other things. He obviously like owned his own winery and had his own brand of wine. Um, and I might be wrong about this, but I believe that, for what I understand, um, oh yeah, no, here it is. He reportedly spent $120 million of his own money and sold a significant piece of his wine empire to produce his latest film, Megalopolis. Um, Very little about it is known. The cast is unbelievable. It's stacked as fuck. It's an epic science fiction drama. And I don't think I've ever even heard of that. Uh, like science fiction thriller, but drama. Um, very little is known about it. However, just recently, it's been in development for a couple years, even before that. Um, but apparently, he showed it to, or a cut, some sort of cut, to a couple hundred people close to him, and it's people are saying it's like, for better or worse, this is going to be one of the like craziest, most out there films ever. Which I am I'm so excited for the film. I'm excited for him. I'm Wow. Talia Shire's in it, believe it or not. I can't wait for this. So yeah, I'm rooting for him. I'm hoping it's a return to form.
I hope he actually owns multiple wineries, and I hope he didn't sell the one that I went to, which was Rubicon, I think it was called. I actually went there during COVID, and there was no one there. It was completely empty, but we were allowed to go in. And there's like a little Coppola family museum the winery is beautiful, by the way. It's in Napa, gorgeous property. And in the winery itself, there's a little museum of like the whole family is like in filmmaking too, which I didn't actually know that before I went there. Like the father and the uncle, and obviously his daughter eventually got into that as well. So there's a whole little museum there to all their accomplishments. I filmed a little video. I always meant to make it into like a little vlog and put it on my channel. In fact, I'm actually gonna probably edit that because we're doing this, and I'll upload that to my Kino Studios channel for any of you who know that. But so if you want to see that, you can check it out. But I hope he didn't sell that, because he owns that one, and he also owns the Coppola winery, the one that you find their wines at all the grocery stores.
Hmm.
So I hope he didn't sell off, because that place is sick. If you're like a Godfather fan, I got that book there, like I said, and there's also a cigar back there that Apparently, his uncle used to
Ooh.
love smoking like this certain kind of cigar, and they sold it in that shop, and I bought one, and it's yeah, it's pretty sick.
Ooh, okay. Sounds
Yeah.
cool. But yeah, so that's gonna be hopefully coming out at some point. I don't really know what the status is. The film is expected to be released in late 2024, so
Oh, cool! It's coming up.
let's hope.
Yeah.
But for our purposes today, we'll be talking about obviously Apocalypse Now is one of my favorites and an incredible film. The Conversation, somewhat well known, but I think it is a very underrated film. It is
Hmm.
incredible. But of course, for better or worse, he is most well known for the Godfather Saga,
Yeah.
um, and a film series that, well, I don't know if the series, but films that you and I are.
Yeah. The duology of one and two is up there like in the top. I don't even want to say 10. It's usually in the top 5 films when people talk about it. Either part 1 or part 2. Um oop, I think Mac disconnected.
There you go.
Um Mac's back. Hopefully that didn't fuck up the the video.
I don't think so. Did it?
I don't see your audio in the timeline anymore, but that might just be okay. I don't know. Let's just keep going. Hopefully this didn't. This program we're recording on records the audio separately, so I think we should be fine. But we'll just keep going for now.
We'll just hope for the best, and then if not, we'll just cut it into the Godfather.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
it'll be like our version of Coda. Like the original version was shit, and then we'll cut it to make it better somehow.
Yes.
We'll talk about the part 3 in a little bit, but which one? I think we mentioned this before, but which one do you like better, part 1 or part 2? Because that's a not a controversial thing, but people have like strong opinions on whether part 1 or part 2 is better.
I think The Godfather Part 1 is the superior film. I could see an argument, even though I would not agree with this. I could see an argument that if you just isolated Michael's story from Part 2, um, it could be considered on par, if not better than Part 1. I don't think I would go that far. I think Part 1 is possibly the closest to a perfect. I think it still has some flaws, but I think it is. If I'm thinking of like perfect films, that might be it. Um, and Michael's section of part 2, while I think it is fantastic, I don't think it is as strong as part 1, but it's still incredibly strong. However, when I'm ranking part 2, I obviously have to take the film as a whole. Um, and the Vito prequel segments of part 2, I was never a fan of. I don't think they helped the film. I don't think I think they're interesting. I think they're good. I think De Niro's great in them, but I do not think that they, if anything, I think they hurt the film overall.
That is a super hot take that you're gonna get some shit for, but
Let's go.
I 100% agree.
100% agree. We are correct. Y'all are wrong. Yes.
I don't, again, and it's not that I don't like the De Niro sections. I think it's cool, and I like that De Niro plays him. I thought that was a pretty cool choice
It was awesome.
to replace Brando, but um, I for me those sections didn't culminate in like a climax that I thought justified its existence.
Yes.
I do get what the point of it is. It's like him, like people talk about this all the time. It's like part 2 is Vito's rise and Michael's fall, right? It's like contrasting the two, kind of mirroring opposite part 1 of like Vito's not really fall but decline and Michael's rise. But I would have preferred, like I get that the climax is him killing that Don, whatever, the little boss of the neighborhood in New York.
Great, excellent sequence, but that doesn't really, for me, work in the scope of the film.
And I get he was making connections, with like Clemenza and all those. It's like, again, it's setting up stuff here, but it wasn't big enough for me. Like that film is a big film. It's an intense film. I would have preferred a more dramatic climax to Vito's story of him really being triumphant or something like that, which again, maybe you could say is like Vito is always the more like understated person, which is why he never, like, why he doesn't fall like Michael falls. Like Michael's more grandiose and he's reaching higher than maybe he should. But yeah, for me, those parts, they're good, but they don't justify their own existence.
Yeah, if anything, this is maybe even a hotter take. If anything, I think that the video sequences would have suited better if they were injected into part one. I still think that like it would have been kind of weird, just because they do take up so much time and they kind of like mess the pacing. But I actually think because when you look at The Godfather, despite Marlon Brando's iconic performance, The Godfather is the story of Michael Corleone. Full stop. Part one and part two together, it is the Michael Corleone saga. Vito is there, of course, but even in part one, I mean, actually, I would argue that I think a lot of people overestimate, um, obviously, like, oh, the Godfather, Vito Corleone. Actually, uh, Vito Corleone screen time, Godfather. Actually,
It's a lot less than Michael because he's also gone from a significant portion while he's shot.
yeah.
And then
Uh,
Michael's gone for a little while when he's in Italy, but yeah, it's
but even
definitely
then,
Michael's story.
it's like a little bit of it's the lull where Sonny is running things, but even then, it's Vito's bedridden the entire time. So yeah, I think that's something that people kind of get lost, where it's like it always is and has been Michael's story. So with part two, and that's why I love the Michael section so much. But when you're cutting it with Vito, it's like I get what you're doing. I get what the point of this is, but it doesn't really it doesn't really vibe with what the film, which is the downfall of Michael. It doesn't really, to your point, they don't really connect for me.
I also think like going back to like unneeded stuff. I felt like Michael's story in part, or not Michael's whole story, but the part of Michael in Italy. And sorry if you hear noise, that's my dog back there. But um, I felt like the story of Michael in Italy is the one negative, the one flaw that I have with part one. I feel that way like about how you feel about the Vito scenes. I felt that way about Michael in Italy. Like I just felt it was like a pointless story that I mean I get the whole thing with Apollonia and him leaving her behind, like going coming back to Kay, but not really like feeling the feelings that he felt for her before. I get that part, but I would have cut this whole storyline of Michael in Italy with Apollonia, and I think the film would have been a more well paced film as a result.
Yeah, so funny. It's so funny you bring that up because it's not so much. Well, there's a couple things because obviously, like for me, the point of the Italy scene, I do think it is important to his arc, um, in the sense that it's sort of him. It's sort of him getting in touch with his roots, with his culture, and that's sort of what leads to him, you know, buying into the um, buying into it when moves back to the states. Um, However, the two big things that kind of bugged me, and I think you probably feel the same way, is one, um, the actual like love story with Apollonia didn't really like when she. Spoilers. Hopefully everyone has seen it, but
Who has not seen Godfather?
you'd be surprised. I think that there are some people who just kind of like, oh yeah, it's like it's a film that I've heard of it, but have I ever actually sat down and watched it? Uh, One, I don't think that like Apollonia's death, because so here's my criticism of part one. This is like the only flaw I can find in the film. When Michael kills Salazzo and then flees to Italy, I understand that as a big moment for him. That is a big that is him crossing a line he never thought he would cross. However, it seems like his transformation, from the Michael prior to killing Salazzo into the Michael who we see return and take over his father's empire, that never really. It's so funny too because like the whole film is about Michael's corruption, and yet that period, which I would say is the most important period of the journey, is kind of glossed over. It's like some argue that's like, well, it was Apollonia's death that sort of like embittered him and made him that. But it's like, well, no, because we kind of see echoes of that before he even meets Apollonia when he's like, in the village. Um, and then the issue there is that like I don't really think that because they kind of skimmed over his relationship with Apollonia, and she isn't really even that much of a character. It's her death. The idea that I can't say so much about the novel, but at least in the film, the fact that her death is what like drove him to become much worse or like much more cold. I I, I mean, you can like argue that, but I just don't. It doesn't really work for me. I don't think it really rings
Yeah,
true.
I think that the love story part of it is like again pointless. You we could have used that time in Italy to build a story that more kind of does that, but I just think a lot of it um i- it's just again I think your culture argument is right. Like it is about Michael rediscover because he was a more Americanized kid among the three sons.
Mhm.
But it's about him discovering those roots and maybe you're right. Maybe the death of Apollonia was meant to be like that's him, like his heart growing cold because of her death. But um,
Mm.
yeah, it just doesn't work for me because like Kay is barely a character too, but in part one, but she's more of a character than Apollonia is. Gorgeous actress. Like I could I get why Michael fell for her, but yeah, I don't think that storyline really worked that much. And
Yeah, I
that's
think
why I
they.
don't like those scenes.
Yeah, I think there's a lot they could have done instead of like instead of having I mean, obviously, like if that sequence was longer and Apollonia was more fleshed out, that maybe could have worked. Um, However, I think they could have equally have done it with him just becoming absorbed with the culture. It's like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do. This is my heritage. I have to honor it. I have to honor my father. They could have gone that angle. And then when he finds out that Sonny was killed, that kind of like flips a switch in him where he's like, they're killing my family. I need to return and clean house. Yeah, the whole Apollonia thing, it just doesn't really. Again, I mean, obviously it's in the novel, but I almost wonder if that was supposed to be more of like I don't want to say cliche, but more of like a because I could see an argument where like because even when I was a kid and watched a film, I think that cultural aspect of it did kind of go over my head, particularly with like with Italy, Sicily, all that stuff. So I almost wonder if Apollonia's death was put in the film to be more of like to try and make it more universal, to try to like make even people who aren't even really tapped in with that can kind of understand what was going for. Um, but yeah, it just doesn't. It. I love the sequence. It's like it's very beautiful. It's done with like very little dialogue. But as for its place in the story and like that shift from Michael into the character we know when he returns, um, it just doesn't really ring true for me.
A thought just popped into my head, and I don't know if this is the case or not, but I don't remember. Do they say that it was the other five families that bombed that car? Like was it his enemies in America that killed Apollonia?
It's never stated in the film. It is heavily implied. That's why Michael is like, because the Godfather is sick. Well, also because he killed Zlatan McCluskey. So yeah, it's heavily implied that who is the oh man, what's his name? Who's the traitor?
The other Barzini.
No, who's the guy? Remember when he's walking to the car and he
Oh,
goes, ah, fuck.
Clemenza. It's not Clemenza. It's the other one. God, I don't remember it either. It starts with an S, I think.
Let me see if I can find it. Not Fredo. Anyways, one of his bodyguards, he's like walking to the car. He goes, "Hey," and then he runs away. And then
Oh yeah.
yeah, and
I know
that's
you're
when
talking
the
about.
car
Yeah.
blows up. So yeah, it's implied that Barzini or someone, Tatalia,
Tatalia, yeah.
yeah, but it's I'm talking about the guy because there's actually a deleted scene apparently where Michael returns and he finds the guy, his bodyguard who killed Apollonia or who planned the car bomb, and he kills him with a shotgun. I don't know if the scene was ever shot. There is some stills from it. But yeah,
Well,
that's
then
a
that does make me think then that like Apollonia's death was meant to be like it's him getting revenge, basically.
yeah.
Like so, but that,
It's
again, I don't think it comes through in the film because it's never
no.
stated, and Maybe they shouldn't have deleted that scene, but it also is a very long film already. So
If anything, they should have transferred that to Sonny. They should have, like, after learning that Sonny was killed, then he's like that kind of drives him to return, and be like the top dog. But yeah, they kind of just, but like, yeah, as soon as he finds out Sonny's dead, it cuts to the scene where Apollonia's murdered. So it kind of was like, it's kind of implied. And then when we then see Michael, he meets with Kay when he returns, and you can already tell he's very, very different. Um, yeah, so that for me is like that's the one segment of the film that never really, still it's very brilliant. It's got brilliance in it, but never really sank. Was always, and again, that's in comparison to the rest of the film, which is just it's excellent for any other film, but for this film, because it is a slight step down, it does stick out
yeah,
for me.
everything else about the film is so perfect that like, and that's why part one to me, I prefer part one over part two, which, part two might be telling a more complicated story, both like plot wise and emotionally, because it's about Michael's kind of, downfall. But part one is so timeless to me that even though it's set in like the 40s or whatever, it feels like it can fit into any time period. Like the clothes and the decorations and stuff don't distract me because it's so universal. Part two, while a very, very good film, feels definitely like a period piece. It feels like that time period, the 60s or whatever it takes place in. And maybe that's intentional in some ways. It is a more specific story to Michael's kind of downfall. Um, but it definitely feels of the time period. And that's the one thing that puts part one above part two for me. Was just that universality of like I can watch part one a million times and never get bored with it just because it feels so timeless.
Hmm. And for me, I think especially is the fact that it's Michael's transformation. Because in part two, he is excellent, but he's much more of a static character in part two. That's not to say that we don't see him, sink deeper into his ruthlessness. Um, but just seeing, I mean, to credit Al Pacino, like it's amazing looking at him in the opening scenes. He's kind of like he has like this like wide eyed, almost like innocent kind of like schoolboy demeanor, and then later on in the film he's just like a completely different person. Again, I almost think that it's almost them getting from A to B, like how that works thematically. I don't know, that's sort of like where to me it's almost, I almost wonder if it's like Al Pacino is so good in the two faces of Michael, he's so good at differentiating them, that is in part why I don't buy. It's like like it's such an unbelievable, incredible physical performance, transformation, that you would need like an extra hour to fully justify it for the film.
Speaking though of Michael's story, we're talking about part one and part two. We also had to acknowledge the third part of Michael's story.
We don't have to.
What, you don't think part three is an underrated gem like Massive Genius from The Sopranos?
To be fair, I do think part three does get a way too much hate. It's again, I even have used it in videos before. I call it the Godfather Part Three syndrome, where it's not bad. It's not a bad film. It's actually a pretty damn good film. But does it even hold a candle to Godfather 1 and 2? No. And that is sort of where it's sort of this weird, like, eh, it's the way you compare them. If you were to just take part 3 and isolate it and hold it up to like 95% of other films, it's still an unbelievable great film. But of course, it's only going to be compared to part 1 and 2, which are like in some other like godly realm that most people will never be able to touch in their lifetimes.
Yeah. It's also a question of like, does this story need to be told? Like, do we need to see this continuation? And I don't
Hmm.
I don't think we needed to. Like part two ended, on this very sad, dark note that Michael had lost his family. He Kay had left him, he killed Fredo, and he was very much alone, and that's reflected in the ending. And part 3 also kind of ends that way, but just kind of it just meanders to the same point. Like he's already alone basically, and he kind of rediscovers a little bit of his family with his brother's bastard son, Sonny's bastard son. I don't even remember his name. But it ends with him losing his family. He loses his daughter, and I don't quite know why we needed that physical death of her to also reflect him losing his family when he'd already lost him at the end of part 2. It's like he gained it
Yeah.
back temporarily just to lose it again, but it's not really the story of a man seeking redemption. I mean, I guess in a vague sense it kind of is, but not really.
Yeah, like what is the lesson that part 3 is trying to, if anything, it's almost strange where it's like part 3, so what is the lesson that even if you do try to make up for your sins, eventually, not only, well, that's the funny thing too, is like not only will it come back to haunt you in the sense that it's not even that he got killed, it's that his innocent daughter like was gunned down in front of him. It's like, and like maybe the film, you could argue it's like, well, it isn't really trying to say anything. It's like, okay, well, I don't, then what are we doing? Like, what is it just supposed to be? That part 1 and 2 was a tragedy, but it was a very, it was like a almost, Shakespearean, Greek. It was the tragedy was based off of Michael's own choices and the results of his choices. Whereas with the end of 3, it just felt, and I don't mean to say this in like when I say cruel, um, did Michael not does is it that Michael didn't deserve it? It's like, well, it's, I don't, did he deserve to like have a happy life? No, given what he's done. But like I don't know. It didn't really seem like he did all that to try and redeem himself, and then he was faced with like the worst punishment imaginable. So was that, are you saying that like that was just simply like random chance, or was that like punishment? And it's like, I don't like, what are we doing? Yeah, I think that's, to your point, I almost wonder if like I don't really know what they were trying to say with it, and that's in part why it doesn't really hold up.
If it had a more like almost corny ending where he did find happiness again, he reunited with Kay, and his nephew took over and his daughter married him, which, by the way, can we talk briefly about the incest? I don't like, it's not even that I find it weird that two cousins are hooking up or whatever. I find it so weird how much attention they draw to it. Like literally like every line of dialogue between the two, even when they're like having sex and stuff, is like, "Oh, kiss me, my cousin. Oh, stick your dick in me." Like, because it's they point it out so much. It's so weird. I don't know why they do this. Like, does he have like a fetish or something? I like it's such a gross point.
Or I almost wonder if it had something to do with like, well, one, again, we kind of alluded to it, but there is some very strange um shit in the Godfather novel.
Mm.
Um, really weird shit. Really, really, like, to the point where like when I first heard it, I was like, I thought it was like fan fiction. I was like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
Probably the most famous is, of course, Sonny, James Caan's character in the film, um, has a enormous penis.
Yeah.
Apparently, like, and there's actually apparently, someone pointed out to me there's a shot in the film that alludes to it where his wife is like doing this.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That's on the beginning.
so it alludes to it, and then also because he has such an enormous dick, um, the bridesmaid who he
Yeah.
hooks up with in the
She has
opening
a
scene,
giant
it
vagina.
said that she also has a giant vagina, and it's just like, what are we doing here?
Yeah. That's the mother of the bastard son, by the way.
Oh, you're right. Yes, you are correct. Um, so yeah, I don't know if maybe because with Mario Puzo, like maybe he just, I mean, I don't want to like put it on him, but I think to the point I sort of alluded to earlier with, or it may have been lost, unfortunately, but I mentioned earlier about how I think Francis Ford Coppola, he showed a lot of restraint in the film in making it all, he wasn't trying to show off everything. He just made everything work so perfectly together into this perfect whole that was even better than the sum of its parts. So I almost wonder if 15 years later, if I don't know, maybe Puzo kind of got a little bit too big of a head and was like, yeah, let's put some weird shit in there.
Yeah,
I don't
I
know.
don't really know. What were we talking? Because that distracted me from the point. We were talking
Oh,
about
we were talking about sort of what was sort of the narrative purpose of part three.
Oh, I was saying that uh, if it had had a more corny ending, I feel like we would still probably give it shit for being like, oh, you're just gonna wrap up this series with everything going back to normal again. But I actually think it would have been more thematically relevant to the story of redemption, and there's the whole thing about the church in part three that I always thought was weird, and I feel like it would have worked better, even though it would have been a very cheesy, predictable kind of ending.
Yeah, and it's but again, even if that was the case, it's like okay, so if it ended like that, then what is the message of the narrative? Is that you can do all this awful shit and be a complete sinner, but there's always a path of redemption.
But
Okay,
that's Catholicism, though.
which is
That
which
is
is
the theme.
true. But to that point, then the question is okay, so if that is the case, then what is the Godfather Part 3 saying? That actually no, that's not true.
Yeah,
Not only is that not true, that you cannot redeem yourself, but it's not even going to inflict you. 'Cause if the film ended with Michael trying to do better and maybe almost winning Kay's forgiveness, but then he himself is killed, so
yeah.
he's never able, okay, that it's, again, to your point, kind of corny. But with Mary's death, it's again, I don't want to say
There's no,
it's a
yeah, it's weird. There's no point
when
to it.
yeah, when I say cruel, it's just it's horribly sad. It's gut wrenching, but for to what narrative purpose?
Michael should have
Um,
died at the end of part three, not her. I think that would have made a lot more
well,
sense.
I mean, he does, but it's just in 30 years later in a cutaway scene, which is such a goofy. I appreciate of how stark it is with him just sitting there and he just dies alone with no one around.
I don't even remember that scene. Was that in the original or is that in
Oh,
Coda?
no, unfortunately, it's original. It's so after Mary is shot, he's on the steps and he's, crying and wailing, and then it cuts to the scenes of him dancing with Kay and Apollonia and Mary, and then it cuts to him um in a courtyard, and he's
Oh,
old and he's got
okay. Yeah,
sunglasses,
I think I
and
remember this.
he
Yeah.
just falls over. And it's on one hand, it's I kind of I do like the poetry of it, that here was this big, larger than life mob boss, and he just dies. And it's a great parallel to Vito's death in part one, where this larger than life figure, he's done all this, he's rising the ranks, and his last moment is playing with his grandson. Which it's if you're gonna go, that was he
It's
got a
definitely
pretty
it's a more hopeful death. Even though he drops over dead, he's dying with family, whereas Michael
yeah
has no one, and in
yes.
his ending.
But even then, it's to your point, it's what is the narrative purpose of this chapter? I don't. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't even remember that. Did you watch Coda, by the way? Because I didn't even watch it.
I know the differences. I've looked into them. I've never actually seen it though. I will have to get around to it one of these
I've
days.
heard it doesn't really fix the
No, I
part
don't
three,
think
even
so.
though people that was what it was advertised as. It was advertised
No.
as we finally fixed part three, and I was like, I don't think you can recut your way into fixing the flaws of that film. I
No.
really doubt that. I mean, unless he filmed literally a second movie that just never
Yes.
got made. I don't imagine a cut could fix that film.
Well, it's funny because again, I think the big question is to your point. It's it doesn't really matter what you do with it, even if you took away the weird incest shit, even if you changed the ending, even if you went back and made Sofia Coppola an unbelievable actress. Which poor Sofia Coppola. I don't think it was her fault. I think Francis was I almost wonder if Sophia was like, "Hey, Dad, I don't think I'm really good in this," and Francis was like, "No, no, honey, it's okay," I
It was because someone else dropped out, right? Like they had someone else signed up for that role, and they pulled out last minute, and so he just subbed his daughter in.
I don't know. I know there were a bunch of other. I think Winona Ryder was
I
considered.
think it was Winona Ryder. Yeah, I think it was. I think it was a last minute kind of thing where they're just like, all right, can we give her a chance?
Oh, you're right. Was initially cast in the role as Mary. Um, but I figured there. I mean, there must have been like other.
I mean, it's Godfather Part 3, right? If
Yeah,
they
I was
took the
gonna
time, they
say.
could find someone. I mean, that whole family though was involved in. I don't know if Godfather specific, but that whole family was involved in the filmmaking process. Again, the father, the uncle was like designing the music and stuff like that. So it was kind of like a family business. And I don't now I'm thinking about it. Maybe there's something thematic about his daughter kind of ruining the family business the same way Michael did.
But again,
Maybe it's diegetic storytelling.
it's funny. But then again, I do think, sadly, I think she not only did. I think it was more Francis for like, because again, at the end of the day, he's the director. It's not like Sophia like held a gun to your head. Your brains are going to be on the script, Dad. Like, no. He's the one who should have like, okay, honey, like let's pick someone else. But also, was she a very weak part of that movie? Of course. Was that the issue with the movie? No. It again, to your point, thematically, it just doesn't really work. It's just, what are we doing? Like, what is this chapter supposed to signify? It's just like, to your, I mean, like, I guess you could say, oh, it's a coda, it's an epilogue. It's like, yeah, but I mean, epilogues can still have a point to the story. They can still, it's like, I just don't, I try to grasp it, and it's just like, I don't know what is part three trying to do here.
Well, also he didn't really want to make part three either. I don't think his heart was in it. Like I think it
Yeah.
was like it was always meant to be part one and part two, and the third film was just kind of a tack on. I
Which,
bet the studios probably pressured him.
and which
So
he's even said that he doesn't even consider part one and part two separate movies. He
no, it's
considers
one
those
story. Yeah,
chapter one and two of a complete story.
yeah,
Um, However, there is this is another weird thing too with the part three. It's funny, we're going to end up talking about part three more than the other two.
that's how it
Um,
goes.
what's interesting is, so again, I think people blame Sophia, which was not the issue. I mean, like, was she a very weak link? Yes, but she was not the issue with part three. But a lot of people also blame the fact that, the original idea, which was, um, part three focusing on Michael going up against Tom Hagen, um,
Yeah,
was
they
sort of scrapped because Robert Duvall did
didn't
not
want to be in it.
want
Yeah,
to return. But even as badass as I think that would sound, um, we could go into a lot of things about, like, Michael casting out Tom in part one, um, and sort of alienating him because he's not a real part of the family. I could see the poetic irony in that. But even so, I'm like, even if it was like excellent and awesome and there were great scenes between them, what what is the thematic? Because again, to your point, you said it perfectly. It's like that moment where he's sitting in the garden and Fredo's dead and his father's dead and Sonny's dead and his mother's dead and he's lost Kay. It's just, that's
yeah,
he's lost. It's like, so
yeah,
what are we? Why do we need more? It
yeah.
doesn't really. Yeah.
I could almost argue that the ending of part one almost says that too.
Yeah.
He
That's
doesn't
a good
say it
point.
directly, but the whole closing of the door, that's like one of the most powerful images in all of the cinema. And you could almost interpret all of part two from just that part. Like obviously part two is still a great film and worthy of being seen on its own. But you kind of got the message that like even though he is on top, the door is closing, right? His family is out. Like, it's not the whole thing with Connie and killing her husband too. I mean, obviously the guy was a piece of shit, but even then she hated him at that point too. So it's part one again stands so powerfully on its own that you could almost argue part two is not even needed.
Yeah, it's almost. I mean, the one shining light of part two, even more so, I think, than Al Pacino's performance, is John Cazale's performance as Fredo. He was great as Fredo in part one. He played his role, but part two is that
he really shines
un-
in part two.
unbelievable. That scene in the lake house, and he, obviously John Cazale was also in The Conversation, Francis Ford Coppola, in Dog Day Afternoon with Pacino, Deer Hunter. What's really interesting about, someone point out to, because obviously we talk about, De Niro and Pacino and Duvall, and throughout the 70s, all these like really major character actors. Something I really appreciate about John Cazale was how he was very, while you have Michael Corleone, who is a very sort of like, he does have complexity, but he is in many ways like sort of like a traditional kind of like alpha, tough guy character. Even other characters like, even Travis Bickle, to some extent, not really, but even Jake LaMotta, there are these very strong attributes of the character. But what was so incredible about Cazale is that he played characters who were so, like Fredo, like just so pathetic. Even Sal from Dog Day Afternoon, he was very like weak, meek character, and yet he was able to he was able to make you, the viewer, still feel for these characters. Like Fredo was the most pathetic, maybe one of the most pathetic characters in all of film history, just from like his body language to everything. And yet it's still incredibly heartbreaking when he finally confronts Michael about everything.
He is the best part of part two, and I
Yes.
that storyline is worth exploring. I do agree. Like I think he's the most underrated part of the Godfather, saga. Like again, you talked about it before, but like everyone talks about Al Pacino, James Caan, Robert Duvall. Those are but I think he is one of the most understated but important parts of the series. And we should also talk about um, Marlon Brando. Real quick, give me your best Godfather Brando impersonation.
I can't even do it. Oh my god.
You come to me on the day of my daughter's wedding
You gotta
and
like
ask me
stick
to be on your podcast.
you gotta like stick your jaw out like this so
Could
you get
go.
this.
Come to me on the day of my daughter's wedding. I don't know, it probably sucked, but
Why have you come? Yeah, I can't do it.
we talked about this before on other podcasts, I think. But his absence from part two is almost as good as his performance in part one. Like it's his presence is so strong that even though he doesn't physically appear on the film, that final scene at the end of part two where he's in the other room, and this is I don't even know why I'm bringing this up because everyone fucking knows this, but the reason he wasn't in that final scene in part two was because he just didn't show up to film because he's a total diva. Um, but his absence is so fucking powerful. I mean, you can literally feel him in that other room, and it's better that he didn't show up on film. It's so powerful.
Which you could almost argue is another argument as to why the prequel scenes don't really work. Um, it's because, again, like in part two, the entire point. Because again, like to your point, part one, I think does. You're right. I think it does drive home the point that like Michael is completely lost at the end of part one. However, part two, and you could argue, I think part two even better than part three, is his comeuppance. At the end of part two, he has to, not only has he lost Kay, the woman he loves, he had to kill his own brother. I mean, that is like that's if that is the hell that he has condemned himself to, that he has to live, and we see his remorse in part three, of course. But yeah, it's almost weird. Like you could argue part one does what part two was trying to do, and then part two does what part three was trying to do. Um, but what's so great about part two is like, as the film goes on, like almost everyone is just gone. Like Sonny's gone, Vito's gone, Fredo's gone, his mother's gone, and then at the end when he's sitting there, to your point, it feels empty. The film feels hollow. Like it's not the film is about family, and in the end, he has no family. Um, so yeah, so not only does it make the final scene, we've talked about this. There was a whole scripted scene between him and Vito at the end of part two, which was fine. It was pretty. I actually think it was kind of a little bit too on the nose. I think the last line that Michael says to him is, "I don't want to be like you," and it's like, okay, it's a little on the nose, you know. Um, but yeah, that scene where he's just sitting at the table all alone while the rest of the family go. It's almost as if, granted, Tom Hagen is still alive, but it's almost as if like that final scene at the table, it's symbolic of the rest of everyone else he knows being dead or out of his life, and he's the only one left. It's like like you put it perfectly, like an accidental instance of like magic, like just unbelievable. Might be the best shot in the entire saga, maybe.
Yeah, and I think you were gonna you were you hinted at something like this, but if we didn't have the Vito scenes in the prequel scenes in part 2, would that moment have even been more impactful?
I think
Because
so.
we've kind
Yeah.
of been seeing Vito throughout the film. Obviously, it's De
Yeah.
Niro, not Brando, but um, like if you're expecting, like, oh my god, we're finally gonna see, Vito at the end of the film, and he doesn't actually appear there. Would that moment be even more powerful? And I think you're right. I think it might even be that better. Obviously, I would like, that De Niro storyline to just be better, like to just climax in a more interesting way. But if we just cut that out, I think that would be a very interesting version of the film. And I almost want to like edit a cut of that myself just to see what it would be like.
Let's do it.
Yeah, we'll make
Let's
it.
do
Well,
it.
obviously, we're not going to distribute that, but amongst ourselves, we'll watch that cut and
And
report
I
back to you.
almost and I almost could say, and again, it's funny when I think about it, like imagine if we took the young Vito scenes of part 2 and tried to splice them into part 1. I almost actually think it would match up better because you could match up Vito arriving in America with Michael arriving home back to the wedding. You could cut Vito's killing of the mob boss with Michael's killing of the other mob boss. Like, I feel like it almost matches up. And that would even be almost more poetic because it's like we see Vito rising in the ranks and he wants to come to America and get what he wants. The entire point is that he says at the beginning, he doesn't want Michael to be like him. He wants to have a son who will go off, and the bitter irony that the one son who he thought was his chance to break free from that ended up becoming the worst one. Is almost it almost would work. That almost would make it more as if it was a tragedy for Vito, as if he almost like is being punished beyond the grave by watching his son fall into
I think
corruption.
you're right. I think that would work better. Are you actually going to cut that together? Because I would
Maybe
watch
I
it if
don't
you
know.
did.
Maybe I'll like I'll fuck around with it.
If you cut that together, I'll watch it. The only downside is that part one is already almost 3 hours long.
True.
So that'll be
It's
basically like a 4 hour film.
hey, whatever.
Yeah,
It's
okay,
a, it
if you make a 4 hour film though, you need to cut in an intermission too, because I need to pee.
yeah. Well, it's funny because it might even work too because in the young Vito scenes, we'll see the scene where he meets Sal. And then later in the film, we find out that he was the traitor who tried to
Oh,
kill
you're right.
Michael.
That'd
And it's like, oh
actually
my
work really
god,
well. Yeah.
it's almost like we see the young Vito scenes of like this, like it's his vision of like what, and we could even like narratively, it could be like, oh, Vito is like thinking back to this time during while he's bedridden, like after he was shot.
Ooh, that
Um,
works actually really well. All
yeah,
right, you guys heard it here. We're gonna have Godfather Part One Coda,
the Kino Macabre cut.
an illegal cut of the film that we
Nah,
do not have the rights to.
just a fan cut.
Just a fan edit, yeah.
We'll put it up on a torrent something. It's like, I don't know if you want to
No,
check
we
it
didn't.
out.
We didn't upload that. No,
Yeah,
I don't know anything about that.
but yeah,
Lawyers
I
from.
think I people will defend it to death. And again, like, does it suck that we'd lose De Niro's performance? Of course. But I think when I'm standing back and looking at the film part 2, um, I just really don't think they go together thematically. It just doesn't really make a prequel film. Do a whole fucking prequel film. I'd watch that. But thematically, I just don't really think it fits.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we've basically hit our hour here. Any final thoughts about Godfather Coppola you want to leave us with?
If you have not seen The Conversation, go see The Conversation. It was funny enough. If I'm not mistaken, Coppola wanted to make The Conversation, but he couldn't get funding in the early 70s. And so twisted his arm. They're like, okay, well, how about this? How about you do us a favor and you adapt this novel, this bestseller novel, and then if that does well, then we'll fund your pet project. And that novel was The Godfather. So in many ways, you might have not only is The Conversation an unbelievable film, Gene Hackman, one of his best performances, if not his best, um, but it you kind of have to the conver- you kind of have to give the conversation credence because it might have been what led to The Godfather being made in the first place. So, yeah,
Absolutely. He also co-wrote the film Patton, which is one of my top 10 favorite films of all time and
yeah,
my favorite war film of all time. So, um, yeah, he's done a lot of good work outside of just these, his most famous stuff.
yeah. And Bram Stoker's Dracula as it's a weird film, but it's interesting for what it is. Um, I think The Outsiders is great. I think Rumblefish is really good with Matt Dillon. Um, I can't really say anything else about the rest of his filmography, but maybe Megalopolis will change that. I'm really I've never rooted for someone more than I'm rooting for.
Yeah, I
That would
can't
be
wait
really
till
awesome.
that part comes out. He also makes some pretty good wine. I like the Coppola family wine. That's good.
I actually have to pick. I've probably had some at some point in my life, but I should probably pick up a bottle and just really check
Well,
it
when
out.
that film comes out, that's a perfect film to just sneak the whole bottle into the theater with you, like in your jacket, and just
They won't know.
drink it straight from the bottle.
All
That's how we honor directors on this podcast. Okay, but thank you for listening to this, everyone. And stay tuned for the next episode of the podcast coming soon. I wanted to ask you, and maybe I should just ask you on the podcast, and we can kind of lock it in here. You've been talking some smack about Lord of the Rings, and have you seen Return of the King yet?
Not yet. I'm still debating. Me and my girlfriend. We have to take a night to do it. We're still debating, and you probably know this for sure, whether we should go for the extended or
I
the
don't. Well, I don't know. You've been watching the
it's
extended cut, so maybe you should just finish it off.
well no, we watched the extended of Fellowship and then we watched the theatrical of Two
Oh,
Towers.
watch it theatrical. We talked about this
Yeah.
before, but I don't want to get into it now because what I wanted you to commit to is I want you to watch Return of the King. And if you
Okay.
commit to watching that before the next episode, I will commit to watching Dune Part 2. And what I thought would be fun for us is to kind of compare and contrast the two because you've been having some very spicy takes on Lord of the Rings, which I actually really like. I like Lord of the Rings. And I have a feeling I am not going to like Dune Part 2 as much as you do. And so I figured it
No.
would be fun to kind of compare and contrast those two and argue our points back and forth on the next
To
episode.
to be clear, I understand that one of my big reservations against Lord of the Rings is due to like I am someone who like Tolkien's philosophy on life. I just if that's your thing, the more like sort of like Christian inspired, traditional modernist um good guy bad guy thing, I think that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not my taste, which is why Dune is like my shit. However, I do agree that they are unbelievably well made films. They're still even watching Fellowship. I was like, there were some shots where I was like, how the fuck, even for back then. And I appreciate the films. Battle of the Helm's Deep was incredible, absolutely. What bugs me is that I feel like there are some flaws that I point out. I'm like, okay, like there are some flaws here. There's still, I mean, we just spent a whole hour talking about The Godfather, Godfather Part Two having flaws. And I think that there are even like fans of The Godfather who will agree. Like, no, they are our flaws. But for whatever reason, when it comes to Lord of the Rings, the films, and I don't know if it's because most people like around my age probably saw them when they were like, younger, like 10, 12, 13, 15 years old. And it just like change their lives, and I understand that. That's fine. But it feels like that they've become a sort of like untouchable. It's like, oh well, there's this. No, do not even say a word about it. And I think that's what kind of bugs me. So am I kind of going overboard with it? Like kind of going hard? Like, do I think they're mid? No, they're not mid. But
I
yeah.
wanted you to say that though. I wanted a very spicy episode where you shit on Lord of the Rings, and it will generate a bunch of hate views for us.
Well, I'll have to see Return of the King because I've heard the theatrical cut.
What's your
Really,
theatrical cut?
because for what I've heard from people is that it actually is not the um they kind of drop a couple plot, like there are certain characters that just completely disappear.
Yeah.
And I even heard from a lot of people that the first half of it isn't even that very well. It's kind of like jankily paced. It's kind of, and then like, but once it gets to the second half, it kind of it's excellent. But
We have 2 weeks before we record the
okay,
next episode. Will you commit to watching Return of the King before the
well,
next episode?
well, actually, I'm actually going to be gone in 2 weeks, so we might have to wait 3 weeks.
Okay, three
Um,
weeks. We'll record it in 3 weeks then.
and I will promise you, I will have watched Return of the King
Okay,
before
and
that
I
time.
promise you that when we record it next time, I will have seen Dune Part 2, and we can get spicy. I want to get spicy here on this podcast.
Well, we can do if you want. Let's do. How about this? Let's do a double-sized or like 1.5 hour episode. 45 minutes for Dune Part Two, 45 minutes for Return of the King, or
We'll talk
45
about
minutes
the,
for
the both
Dune.
series, both series,
Yes,
both of them. Yeah.
yes, I love
Okay.
it. Let's
Cool.
do
We'll
it.
do that next time. All right. Thank you all for listening. You heard it here, folks. The next episode's going to be very spicy, so 100% tune in for that. And we will talk to you then. So have a good night, everyone.
Take care, y'all.